Thank you so much for having me. And this is really a favorite talk of mine. It directly relates. I guess the bio didn't mention that I just had a book launch 2 days ago. And of course, the hustle is real, but it really ties into the book that I just published. And I'll just hold it up because I can and should and will. It's Detoxify. And it's really how I took, 22 years of rheumatology clinical training. I'm here at my office. What I've seen, what I've experienced, what I've read, what I've gone through with that training and clinical practice, tied it into integrative medicine training, and then really the environmental health exposure component that I've been learning over 15 years. So I put it all together in a book. I put it into these talks to show people how these things intersect. And then maybe people can take that away and use it, especially folks like you guys who are well-trained and have your own set of patients and clientele to educate on. So with that, I'm going to get started because I have a ton of slides. I'm going to move pretty fast because I really do want to make room for question and answers, which actually tends to be very entertaining and more fun anyways. So let's get going. All right, let me figure out how to do that. Okay, and I do not have disclosures. I don't sell any products. I don't endorse anything, so I can get this into educational programs. So that's a choice I've made. And hopefully it makes the work. Objectives: discuss the epidemiology of autoimmune disease. We're going to get into that. We're going to also talk about some certainly evidence-based strategies for autoimmune issues. We're going to talk about environmental exposures, what we're living with right now in terms of human environments, and a little bit of anthropology. We're going to discuss some of the mechanisms, how some of these toxics, which are really how chemicals should be identified as toxics, actually not as toxins, on the immune system itself. And then really talk about more conventional and integrative functional medicine approaches to reducing those exposures and patient management for autoimmune disease. So it's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm just going to try to do it as best I can. So when I talk to folks, patients, clientele, I love this slide. Really, it's actually main part of a TED Talk I did because I wanted people just to understand even the good stuff, bad stuff, what we put in our bodies include even vitamins. Like we think of vitamins as so healthy for us, but yet they have coloring, they have additives, they have fillers. Of course, asparagus is fabulous, but we also may see pesticides, packaging chemicals, that kind of thing. And thinking about what we put in, on, and around our bodies and how we walk through life is a really good starting point. What rooms we walk through, what we bring into our homes that are airtight, what we put on our skin, our personal care products, even our feminine care products. I think we also miss some of the routes of entry into the human body, like tampons, feminine care products, intravaginal exposures, which is super absorptive. Thinking about all the different entrance ways into the body is really critical. And then really this slide was to show that all of this is happening on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly basis. And I added up for the TED Talk. I used 27 chemicals in a day and I decided to multiply it out. I counted up in a 24-hour period what I estimated to be my exposures. And I really, the patients, I don't think we always have that perspective because we're all struggling to just survive and function and take care of kids and patients and all that. So the production of chemicals has really just incredibly quadrupled over the last really 80 years, 75 to 80 years. It mostly took off around World War II when we had the invention of pesticides for overseas combat, managing pestilence over there. We also had ways of taking food and making it so that we could store food for long periods of time on shelves with canned foods, BPA, which lines a lot of these cans in order to make less contact with food and drinks with metal. So they put an epoxy lining, which is BPA we'll talk about. But there were lots of different inventions that came in and around that time. And the reason being is that we wanted them, we needed them. We made plexiglass to make aircrafts lighter. We had naugahyde, rayon, formica countertops when I was growing up in the 70s. We had polyvinyl chloride and everything. We had non-breakable plates in the 50s to make it easier for housewives and whatever they marketed it to not have to clean up a mess. It was just really a big time for compound synthetic chemical invention. The problem is we never figured out at that time how to better regulate them, how to require testing for these chemicals in terms of safety, toxicity, particularly in very vulnerable populations, pregnant women, young children, and even menopause. All these changes with hormones, those are very vulnerable periods of human development. Teenage years, which I teach high school and try to teach them that. But the idea is that we let the genie out of the bottle and it's very hard to get it back in. And so we've had such an increase and look, this only goes up to 2005. I have to find another slide that actually fills in the gap, but I can tell you this is only increasing exponentially. In fact, even plastics are supposed to be tripled by 2060. So we have, and plastics can contain not just microplastics, which we hear a lot on the news in terms of their actual physical bulk, but they have very small molecules of compounds that are infused into plastics, such as antimicrobials, coloring, BPA and phthalates, and a bunch of things that are recycled. It's a big mess. We've created it. Now we got to figure out how to stay healthy through it. And that's a lot of what I do with my work. I really want people to have solutions because that's what I was looking for 15 years ago. And I'm trying to get people to think about solutions for their own health, but also to share with patients. Very simple, practical stuff, doesn't cost a lot of money. And so that's the goal. So this is really called environmental health. And I didn't even know what this was. I didn't learn about it in med school. I didn't understand that there was literally thousands of papers even 15 years ago that talked about how air quality affect human health in various ways, how flame retarding chemicals and couches were infused into our home furnishings in the 70s to keep us from burning up in 12 seconds time, which literally was set up by the tobacco industry. So there's lots of information. Chicago Tribune got I think it's the Pulitzer Prize for that reporting and investigation regarding who's behind those chemicals in the 70s. I didn't know any of this stuff 15 years ago, nor would I have expected to, but I would have liked to have learned this in training programs. I would have learned especially that there was hormonal changes that can occur with many classes of chemicals that we are now exposed to. At that time, it was mostly hormone changes known as endocrine disruption. Now, since that time, we have enough data and information and bodies of literature to support that we have immune disruption, and which is why in the book, I go after immune disrupting chemicals as I've coined it, because I've never seen it in the literature. And it's just a reframing of a lot of the same harm, but through the eyes of or through the framing of the immune system, autoimmune epidemic, immune disorders, food allergies, and why we see these chemicals having those effects as well as hormonal changes. By the way, the endocrine system of the human body and the immune system and the neuroendocrine system all communicate, they all crosstalk to get things done. But it was just a simple reframing to help people who are managing these diseases. So in terms of definitions, I mentioned toxin versus toxins, poison, biohazard, adjuvant. There's lots of different names for what we consider pretty pathetic. And ones are actually from snake bites, but toxics are really the correct terminology for human-made chemicals. Time magazine, this is 2010. It's pretty shocking, but they were at least showing us that we had enough data to warn pregnant mothers that we had exposures in utero exposure that during pregnancy that actually could potentially harm not only the fetus, but successive generations, because the placenta unfortunately does not protect the growing fetus as much as we would hope or would have liked. There was a 2005 study from EWG, which was pretty well known, that they took the cord blood of 10 everyday Americans, just 10 Americans, babies born. They took the cord blood and studied it and found over 200 industrial chemicals. And that was in 2005, which fast forward now, we now know that there are thousands more that have been added because there's no regulation in terms of the testing or stop gaps or any of the things that we would like to say to manufacturing. Manufacture really does have the strongest hold in the US market. When it comes to environmental chemicals, again, I was mentioning endocrine and immune disrupting chemicals that exist that can affect all sorts of hormone-related functions, thyroid, obesity, all of the things that affect growth and development, fat cell enlargement, insulin function, breakdown, resistance. But these things also affect, from an endocrine perspective, hypertension, reproductive ability, and fertility. But also, believe it or not, in utero exposure, our neurodevelopment, cognition, genitalia formation, as we know, with phthalates can cause the problem with cryptochytis, and dimorphic sex brain differences of the brain. So it's not just the body that becomes male or female, technically, it's really the brain that becomes male and female as well. And there are changes noted from exposures in utero for this issue as well. And transgenerational exposure can affect genetic changes in utero that affect successive generations, because we know that in utero, a female eggs, all our eggs are basically set. And so exposure to the mom is also exposure to the fetus, which is also exposure to the eggs of successive generations. Same can be said for male genitalia. and structures that go on to create sperm and seminiferal tubules. So again, 3 generations are really exposed when you're talking about a mother exposed to anything. And it could be good or bad. It could be organic fruit and vegetables and a sunny day, or it could be like when I was pregnant, lots of McDonald's, hot black plastic. I think it was the breakfast special that I had probably every morning of my first child's pregnancy because it was just so good. When you know better, you do better. Anyway, so exposome, understanding how our environment affects our health and affects the proteins that sit on our genes is really an important topic. We know that lifestyle and exposures can actually change our exposome. And exposome, by definition, is your whole lifetime exposure from in utero exposure to death. It's like your lifetime cumulative exposures. And it also includes, by the way, environmental health, radiation, light pollution, noise pollution, stress, gut microbiome effects, medications, infections. So there's a lot more than just chemicals, but they one way or another. So it's something to really be thinking about. I'm not going to spend too much time, but anyway, there's lots of names for inflammatory triggers. You can have synthetic chemicals, you can have natural products, even herbal products that you wouldn't expect to cause a problem can cause autoimmune liver disease. You can have infections. Vaccines certainly they are used to initiate, obviously, an immune response. That's how they're designed. But they can also come with adjuvants that may be considered an issue. Maybe they need to be reformulated. We've had some issues with some vaccines over the years, but then they've been pushed out and done their job. Big topic. I don't want to get into it too much, but certainly we know vaccines have been remarkable as medical breakthroughs. I want to make sure that we even-handedly discuss them and judge the science for each individual vaccine. That's what I say. Medications, certainly we have in rheumatology. A lot of people don't know that we have something called drug-induced lupus, which we'll talk about. And that means that medications can actually instigate certain rheumatologic conditions, as well as drug-induced dermatomyositis, which is pretty remarkable because I just had a patient I think has that. So medications, although they can be very helpful, we don't like to use them, at least I don't, reflexively. I like to see what they do, how they work, what's the endpoint, what are the goals, what are the side effects, all of that, interactions, but also keeping in mind that medications can also instigate actual rheumatologic conditions is a really important notion. Okay, autoimmune diseases, there are known about 80 of them in the Western literature, but we all know that long haul COVID wasn't in the Western literature. We know that there are things that people experience that may not actually have criteria and may have not been gotten into medical textbooks. And I think that's really important when you're listening to patients because I see everything. I see everyone with everything over 22 years. And they don't all fit the criteria for any one given autoimmune disease. There are a lot of gray zone conditions, and we need to validate patients for that because they often get sent out from a lot of different specialties or even primary care because labs look normal. And I talk about that in the book. And I have cases in the book that I want people to read about because they will resonate with people who've been told that they're fine on paper. They can involve every organ, cell type, skin, liver. We have rheumatoid with the joints, that kind of thing. Epidemic rise has occurred. And we know this not just because we're better at assessing. A lot of people make the excuse, oh, we're just better doctors or we're more aware. I would venture to say that's likely not to be true. And the epidemiology doesn't support that because we now, as a medical system, have 15-minute appointments for follow-ups, maybe 30 for new patients. It's incredibly hard to argue that. Primary care is overwhelmed. There's no way that people are getting just so much better. I don't think the testing is necessarily better. We have to get better interpretation of all studies we order. 3 to 10 times more cases in women and men for autoimmune diseases, which there's great science on that. And I actually put it in the new book. Certain gene findings that were very recent, also discussing hormone changes and estrogen as being a driver for the fact that women are more affected, but men get lupus and men get rheumatoid and men get things that you would mostly assume to be women's autoimmune issues. And that has to be looked at and actually listened for, believe it or not. Many factors associated with disease risk and development, for sure. So we'll get into some of that. Anyway, when I was trying to take this topic and really break it down from a sky-high view, there's so much to discuss here. There's the exposure of what we're exposed to, which also has its issues, right? What are the known toxicity issues that have been studied? Because again, a lot of this stuff doesn't make its way into clinical hands. It's really has to be studied through academic centers and third parties because, again, manufacturers don't do a lot of this work or at least don't reveal what they've discovered. They don't have to. What are the mechanisms of exposure? What are the metabolites, which often can be more toxic than even the precursors? Half-life of these chemicals, whatever they may be, the involved organs, what are the target organs for harm, whether they're active or inert. in terms of their additives. Environmental conditions can change how drug chemicals work. And also pseudopersistence is like how much are you exposed from so many different sources that even if you give up one target, one route into the body, you might have more from other areas of your life. There's host issues, which really are you strong enough and healthy enough to maybe offset some of the effects from chemicals? What's your age? What's your gender? Comorbidities? Those kind of things. How's your gut working? Are you on multiple medications, which in and of themselves can have synergistic problems, not just the chemicals that they're now mixing with from life exposures? So those are mixture studies and detoxification mechanisms. How well are they working? How's your kidney, liver, skin, lymphatic system, all those things have an effect. Disease latency and genetic variability play a role. Of course, you can expose to 9/11 chemicals, and then 20 years later, as a family member is experiencing, we're now seeing issues in young, healthy people that perhaps it was related. Who knows? But we do know that there's certainly a latency with smoking. We've seen that with skin cancers. So thinking about that is important. Okay. Now, inflammation, chicken or the egg, does it cause disease? Is that a fair assessment, or is it really the result of these issues? It's really hard to say, but we do know that inflammation, I think, is a little overused because I think it's a sellable term. And yes, we have a lot of inflammation, even bubbling at a very low level that doesn't become clinical. But I think also thinking about the term inflammation and trying to be more specific as opposed to making it so general, I think is very helpful to patients. It sells a lot of products on TikTok and Instagram, but I think we need to be more thoughtful. And those of you who understand that, hopefully you'll get it. So when I was this was actually part of a talk I gave with Fred von Saal, who is my co-author for 2 of the textbooks with Oxford. And he's this brilliant emeritus professor. And it was just such an amazing thing to work with him and crazy, awesome mentor. But we did a talk at the beginning of COVID, believe it or not, on how the low-level inflammatory status of humans in today's world, due to the fact that we're exposed to so many chemicals, actually sets us up for greater morbidity and mortality from infection. And at this point, it was COVID. And we knew that more COVID comorbid conditions led to greater risk for having outcomes. We knew that. We also knew poor nutrition did, vitamin D levels, a lot of other things. But at this point, we were giving this lecture to a bunch of colleagues, and we were talking at the cellular level. I did this talk. I don't know, I did this talk with or without him, but anyway, he's amazing. I'm trying to remember what I said. So this had a lot to do with how the cellular context of the cell and how there's this incredible surveilling system in the inflammasome of the human cell. You can see some of our biology, my kids in biology, right? So mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum, and you have all these different components, but the inflammasome is a really interesting component of the human cell. It actually works like their surveillance mechanism. And here's the inflammasome, and you can see a bunch of proteins that's put together, but it basically can crosstalk with a lot of the organelles in the cell. And when it senses something inflammatory, it gives feedback. As you can see here, you can have pro-inflammatory IL-1 beta and IL-1 18. So this is really a surveillance in the cytosol that can recognize problems within the cell structure and start its feedback through this inflammatory cascade. NF-kappa beta is a master cell for homeostasis in the cell. And you can see that there is enough data, and this was 2018. So basically what we're seeing is that a lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals known to disrupt the function receptors of hormones and the endocrine system not only play a role in the inflammasomes, but also play a role directly on the gut microbiota. They can also alter the microbes in the gut, which I talk about in the book in great detail. They have mitochondrial dysfunction effects and reactive oxygenating species effects. They can even affect circadian rhythm. So the idea that they can affect the cellular components, then organ components, then moving into metabolic disorders, and also immune disorders, as we'll find out later on. But the idea is that this is a cascade of exposure into clinical disease. So I wanted to make sure people were well aware of that. And then you can get these metabolic conditions, which, by the way, are immunologic and hormonal, all crosstalk. But you can see that there are changes in fat cells in terms of how much is made from stem cells, how fat they get. You can see insulin resistance from adiponectin blockade. Anyway, there's lots of different effects, as you can see, on different components of the human body. Now, autoimmune diseases, it's a big topic. It's gotten bigger over the last couple of decades because rheumatology as a field has expanded dramatically. And of course, we always talk about genetic predisposition. There's no question that anyone who develops disease It's this dance between lifestyle exposures and genetic predisposition. And in rheumatology, we do have some really interesting studied haplotypes that are associated with diseases like ankylosing spondylitis and psoriatic arthritis. We often will get an HLA-B27, but hey, that can affect 8% more or less of the US population without having clinical disease. So it can be a red herring unless you're getting the full history of understanding their exposures, their microbe exposures, infections, stress levels, understanding how poor sleep can affect clearance time of chemicals in the lymphatic system, permeability of the gut. And then there's these perpetuators of inflammation, which really means that we're low level exposed, but then we have these things that continuously piss off the body, right? Medications, perhaps, sleep, stress, poor diet, sugars, caffeine, whatever, alcohol. You can go into a lot of them, but they perpetuate a problem that maybe we can either fix or try to modify. We know that autoimmune diseases are often related to infection. I think that's really important to understand as well. But the numbers have increased over time in terms of where we've gone in terms of the exposures. Type 1 diabetes is definitely linked to infection as well. It's probably one of the most well-studied, believe it or not, but it's important to pull that into the equation. But yeah, these things have been rising over time. Rheumatoid arthritis is now 1% of the US worldwide population. Used to be like 0.5. We now have 7 to 14% of the US population with one of 80 of the known autoimmune diseases, which is about 24 to 50 million people out of 330 million people. So these are things we want to be on the lookout for. Mechanisms for autoimmune disease, this could take at least a day, each one of these descriptions, but I talked a little bit about the NLRP3 inflammasome. It's part of the innate and plays a role mostly in the inflammatory system, as well as adaptive, because they all communicate, right? But it's in the cytosol. We know molecular mimicry is really an important topic. If you want to read more about it, it's really how these compounds can basically look like self-antigens. And so the human body's immune system starts to look at these chemicals and doesn't know chemical from self. And that's how you start getting these autoimmune reactions. You can have autophagy, which is basically this clearance process we have in the human body. Evolutionarily, it's awesome. But if it's lacking in its ability to clear properly, then you can have stimulation of the immune system towards self and towards the systems that can't clear. You can have the lack of a kill switch like apoptosis. Yes. Loss of tolerance, which is as we age, our immune system becomes a little weaker over time. So we have to be more conscious of those sort of non-clinical sepsis and UTIs that turn into all sorts of problems. So then there's this background noise of inflammation that Dr. Vom Saal and I were trying to share at the beginning of COVID, was this background level of inflammation of where we are as humans. Then you add another insult and it's really too much for the human body to bear. Thinking about how we can reduce inflammation as the background noise was the whole point of the book, because we are probably going to be exposed to other things in the future. It's likely. So we want to clear house and do the best we can with our inflammation at baseline. So case one, 47-year-old obese woman, history of Hashimoto's for 15 years, BMI 36. So obese by definition, although that's a whole nother topic, right? How do we define obesity anymore? TPO antibodies were positive, but she had normal thyroid panel. She had some elevated C-reactive protein, which can certainly have certain reasons why CRP is elevated, including obesity can affect that number. On Synthroid, her history was so important because she had multiple hits to her gut with antibiotics as a child, not just one or two things here and there. You can hear after a while whether or not it was really remarkable. She had ear tubes and multiple infections and must have been on antibiotics and out of school all the time. Those are the stories you're listening for. She also had a really poor diet and had canned foods quite a bit. And on BPA analysis, I don't test a lot of people. People find that interesting that I do what I do and I don't do a lot of testing because I really don't want people to spend that kind of money out of pocket outside of Quest and LabCorp and their insurance, because it's a lot of money that could be used towards better choices, paying for reverse osmosis water filter, getting organic food. So I'm very conscious of people's money, and I think we all should be. But anyway, so the BPA levels in this particular patient were really sky high because all she did was eat canned foods. And BPA can have a lot of effects on autoimmune risk. And so to tie it to Hashimoto's for 15 years and knowing that was part of her history was something we could work on. You can't always get people off of thyroid medicine, but you can work on exposures and help heal her gut microbiome. BPA is one of the first, probably the first endocrine disrupting chemical to be identified. It was identified by Fred von Saal and all of his colleagues. What is the book that was really with Al Gore? Anyway, Uncertain Future or something future. Anyway, so this is the group of researchers that really got started on this work because they discovered BPA worked at really low levels, lower than anyone would have imagined because we didn't have the assays to figure it out. But at this point we did, to do the same physiologic changes or actions as high dose exposures. And that was the rift with traditional toxicology, by the way, because traditional toxicology says the dose makes the poison. It's linear. The more you're exposed, the more your outcomes are going to happen. I use drinking. I shouldn't probably use drinking. The more you drink on your 21st birthday, the more likely you're going to get sick, or the more cake you eat, the more you're going to be nauseous, whatever you want to call it. Toxicology, right? Directly in the face of that is this whole concept of non-monotonic dose response, where you can actually identify low-level exposure of BPA and many of these other chemicals identified now as endocrine disruptors at parts per million, parts per trillion, so low that no one would have ever bothered to look, so low that EPA wouldn't identify it as a problem, so low that manufacturers don't want to hear about it because then they can't explain themselves out of this problem. And that understanding how low dose exposures work like hormones, which are low dose and do incredible things, is really important to make those connections. And this was done. This was done with great science, and we have plenty of it. And I have it in all the books, and you can find it online. But estradiol is very similar to bisphenol A because of these hydroxyl rings, and then DES, which is also a drug that was actually given in the 70s to women to prevent miscarriage, was really quite important. So that turned out to be a real problem and had lasting effects to generations after the women who were exposed and taking this medication. So DES, estradiol, bisphenol A, they make, by the way, in the 1930s, they discovered BPA actually makes people fat. It makes muscle tissue bigger, and they used to feed it to chickens. Then it became DES as a medication for other reasons. And then, as you can see on the bottom, it's very similar to thyroxine. So all of this really connects in terms of, how exposures can directly, I should say really directly, but indirectly as well, because we have so many confounders in contributing to, say, Hashimoto's, but also other conditions. BPA was taken out of plastic baby bottles in 2012, which hat tip to Fred von Saal and his crew around the world. But it was so powerful to take it out of plastic baby bottles, and yet they were not able to do that anywhere else. Now, mind you, within the last few weeks, I signed on to a letter with, I don't know how many other IDC researchers, and they ended up moving the needle in Canada, by the way, stopped using BPA in food packaging. And I think they're working now to get that out of packaging in the US. It's such a heavy lift, but the idea is that BPA is mostly, from an ingestion perspective, comes into the human body through diet, through canned food. So it's a recommendation that I make to switch to frozens, fresh, or at least wash your produce off out of a can. Obviously, socioeconomic things we have to think about, but there's a lot of really simple, cost-effective choices, as I lay out in the book. But it also is used to set ink on thermal receipts like tickets, parking tickets. I tend to do a lot of recommendations like fold up your receipts or don't take them, email them. So really a lot of solutions to all these issues, but this is where BPA resides. It's probably the most abundantly used chemical. I think they call it high input industrial chemical used. It's so pervasive. It's just not in plastic baby bottles, which is great, but it's in everything else. There's also a lot of BPS, maybe a lot of regrettable substitutions. We have some studies, I got to pick up my speed here, studies that show that this crossover study showed that just canned food, one can a day for lunch, that was actually, they used Progresso versus homemade soup, changed the BPA urinary levels by 1,000% just over the course of a 2-week period. So this can be done. It has a very short half-life. And so getting rid of BPA, at least from food sources, can be very reasonable and easy to do. So then you just have to start thinking about other places that, I recommend in the book. So here's pathogens of BPA. So we now know lots more about not just endocrine function, but also how it can work in the human body. And then this is just one example of a chemical, right? There are thousands, almost, chemicals that are now used as a number for the number that are exposed in our lives. But I like to use just one really smart chemical that, I shouldn't say smart, but clever chemical that has really caused a lot of havoc and how it works. We know that it can also be changed in the liver with the P450 acetylchrome P450 system and enzymes that can contribute, by the way, to autoimmunity. in terms of how it's broken down. We know that in many cases, chemicals can break down to more toxic components than the originating exposure. We know there's effects on IL-17 and a bunch of other adipose regulatory cytokines. Case number 2, 67-year-old with male breast cancer, no family history, poor diet. I put a lot of red herrings in here. No family history of breast cancer, but you'll recognize this because you probably got a lot of emails about Camp Lejeune, worked in a contaminated military site. So what I wanted to do was show a couple chemicals and how they affect human health. And then my slides were how clinical disease could be worked backwards to identify chemicals. Two-pronged approach, contaminated water. Camp Lejeune is a remarkable, unfortunate part of our history. We know that there are thousands of forever chemicals, but definitely triethylene. I've done a lot of legal cases, so I know this stuff pretty, unfortunately, too well. And basically, we got exposed to TCE during that time period because the wells were unlined. People were drinking the water. Came from TCE as a degreaser, so they were using it in military trucks, and it went into the water system. It's also used in dry cleaning, textiles. It's also used in the food industry to extract fats from soybeans and other plants. It was designated as a known carcinogen, TCE, in 2016. It was identified as a group 1 toxic carcinogen by IARC, NTP. So we know enough about this. And it goes up and down, by the way, surprise, with military issues, with wars, because it's a degreaser as this primary issue. It actually is an inhalant for anesthesia. And I think who's the King of England? He actually was born using this as the Queen's anesthesia. So it's a fun fact, but that can be found. But anyway, it was used for a while in Europe and the United States as an anesthesia, but low harm for that, at least that was identified. TCE has so many links to autoimmune issues and as well as cancers, which, by the way, are immune derived as well, or else giving cancer treatments wouldn't result in autoimmune diseases, which often is a sign of success of chemotherapies. We know that these systems are connected. We know that breakdown of TCE, unfortunately, the TCAH, trichloroacetaldehyde hydrate, is actually more toxic than actually its precursor chemicals. We know that the TCAH actually has effects directly on CD4 T cells, liver proteins, also problems with repair. Again, when you have a problem, if you can't repair it, that's also just as problematic. And TCE and autoimmune disease, we know that development of a clinical disease also depends on all of these different factors, right? So we have so many different confounders in humans. We can study them so much better in animal studies. I go into a bunch of these mechanisms we don't have time for. Rheumatoid arthritis, 1% of the human population, has been increasing, by the way. It hasn't stopped. We know I'm seeing younger and younger patients. One of the premises of the book was that I could not understand why there were so many younger people getting diseases at younger ages than we would expect, that I was trained on, but also with no family history. So these are de novo cases where environment plays a key role in trying to figure out how they were developed. And getting that history is so critical. Rheumatoid arthritis, it's T helper cell 1 cytokine-mediated condition, whereas lupus is a little bit more B cell derived, but they all interact. There's a constant feeling that there's no cause. I think it's total BS. We have so many studies that show gut microbiome links, certain periodontal disease, and certain microbes in the mouth. Now, they're not direct cause and effect. Oh, if we got rid of periodontal disease, all of rheumatoid arthritis would be gone. But I think it's important to know the influences versus causes, associations versus causes, and work on those influences as much as we can. So there's studies of cold environment. We'd be trouble in New Jersey. There's cold here, but it's just, these are some studies that have been identified, just like MS and vitamin D levels usually in the warmer belts have less, as we learned in med school, than compared to colder environments. These are things that were identified. Shift workers, possibly related to melatonin loss or disruption, which is a huge antioxidant in the human body, can affect breast cancer risk, but also rheumatoid arthritis. And so there's lots of influences, air pollution, obesity, the list goes on and on. I just wanted people to know that in that list includes EDCs and immune disrupting chemicals, IDCs as well, and how they work, of course. Also medications, treatments for cancer, not to say that anyone wouldn't do that, but there are certain studies that show that using statins, for instance, and this was a cohort in the UK where they have great record keeping, they found that within the first year of using statins, there were higher rates of developing rheumatoid arthritis. As I mentioned, cancer therapies often can result in Rheumatologic conditions, we should be aware of that. If you are someone who takes care of anyone with cancer or cancer therapies, you should be identifying, if you can, autoimmune diseases that are subsequent to those treatments, which, are obviously and arguably worth it if your life is saved, but you want to be catching those and treating those. COVID and autoimmune disease, certainly saw higher numbers. It's an immune stimulant, any infection, of course, and I saw more autoimmune cases. And so I put a lot of those up. And I also put this article that there was also some recognized autoimmune phenomenon post-vaccine. So every vaccine can potentially have that risk. And this is from immunology. So this came out here it is down at the bottom, let's see, 2022. So we're still getting information about things that we would like to learn about. And I think we need to do it judiciously. Case number 4, I'm not going to have time for any more soon, but I'm going to just talk about this case of a 21-year-old female with a positive ANA, which is a whole nother topic, but very high ANA. Remember, these are titer levels. So a 1 to 40, 1 to 80 are pretty low, and 1 to 1280 is higher, more problematic, more worry. Some, and you look into it deeper, but don't test for things you can't interpret. I also would like people to keep that in mind so you don't scare patients. If there's no real problems there, be prepared to handle those answers. Yeah, she had childhood emotional abuse. These are things I wanted people to think about in terms of her development of possible lupus, right? You want to be thinking about poor diet and supplements. And she was also taking oral minocycline. So to get to my point about drug-induced lupus, in case you never heard of it, there are many drugs that are known to increase the risk. In terms of minocycline, yeah, I've seen Propecia, I've seen minocycline, but the patients are really not feeling well. It's all soft stuff, skin, joints, nails, hair loss, that kind of thing. And it's very complicated how drug-induced lupus works. You can have a genetic predisposition, drug changes, it stimulates the immune system. And guess what? It turns out that when you take away the drug, if it is drug-induced lupus or drug-induced dermatomyositis, you can actually see a total response. ANA goes down, joints, liver, everything. Soft stuff, rash, joints, whatever, get better. So there's a way to do that. Rheumatologists know how to work that up generally, but essentially, if you can afford to stop the medication, if you look them up, there's 100 of them at least that can do this. You might start there. Okay, lifestyle matters. This is from NHANES, a National Health and Nutrition Exam studies. We know that lifestyle can affect our risk for systemic lupus, for rheumatoid arthritis. Integrative rheumatology is essentially all of that in a bag of chips. We're trying to do, and functional rheumatology as well. We're trying to use everything we can to get to the root cause. We want to get a great history. That is the key to everything. It's unfortunate our system doesn't really enable that in many ways. We want to think about diets. There's so many, but we want to really be thinking that food is medicine, and that when you do these activity scales, like this is a study on disease activity based on diet. Yes, people do better. People do have reactions that are positive, and people will tell that not just in a self-survey, but also you can look at their inflammatory markers. Mediterranean diet is probably the most well-studied for inflammation reduction. We know that all of these components are really helpful. We know the gut microbiome is so sensitive to what we eat and what we don't eat, by the way, and also what we have in our drinking water, which no one pays attention to. So I want people to be thinking about dysbiosis and autoimmunity. This was a study was so interesting that they looked at type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid and lupus and went backwards to look at the microbiomes to see that they are disrupted. And we should be thinking about that. We also know drugs other than antibiotics can play a key role in disrupting gut bacteria. So again, knowing, like Andrew Weil taught me and all of his disciples and everyone he can tell, is that you want to know least amount of drug, what it solves, what's the criteria, when's it end? Well, you want to really know why we're using drugs. And if you need them, fine. That's great. I use drugs all the time in rheumatology, but you want to use them judiciously. You want to service the gut with probiotics, reduce stress. You want to manage supplements. God, it's a nightmare out there. Quality, I talk about all of that in the book. I have a whole section on human fertilizer, I called it, and what I think every human anthropologically really needs in modern day times, and why, and how to figure out those supplements and share with patients because they're looking for better quality stuff they can afford. There's so many supplements that I think people get lost in the mix, and I think taking them away is actually what I spend more time doing. Certainly, curcumin is great for all of its anti-inflammatory components, but it also has been implicated in liver function problems, in liver poisoning, because people not only just take poor quality ones, but if they even take good quality ones, they take too much at higher dose than they should. It was New England Journal of Medicine did a great case report on this. So we want to be thinking about curcumin, alpha omega-3 fatty acids, other nutrients, which, oh, by the way, are part of human evolution. Again, a big part of what I discuss in the book, so we understand where we are now. Air quality matters. Dust in your home matters. Pesticides matter. Oh gosh, that was my water filter. I go into a whole chapter on drinking water, what we should be thinking about. Exercise floods the liver. Really, these are the detoxifying pathways I want people to think about. Again, I go into the science behind this and sweating, how movement matters, muscle matters to the immune system, sleep matters to the immune system, how to look up products, personal care products, how to avoid things like BPA, and certainly how we can look at the triangles on the bottom of our food plastic containers and avoid, say, 3, 6, and 7, which is vinyl is 3, 6 is polystyrene, other is typically BPA. And then getting really smart about being a detective. I think my work as a rheumatologist, a lot of people would agree that rheumatology tends to be the field of, I don't know, send to a rheumatologist. It's so complicated. It's detective work, all fields, but I don't know. I seem to think that this is a big one where we got a lot of complicated stuff. Here's some very basic questions to ask. You don't necessarily need the 50-question survey that I want people to have available and to give themselves a 1 or a 0 and kind of add up their scores and see where they begin in the process. But this is a really good way to start. I also don't want to forget climate action, climate change, and how it will affect human health moving forward, air pollution, water quality. These are really key concepts. So I want people to be conscious of that. I hope to do a talk on that not long from now from a rheumatologist perspective, because I think we need to be prepared, what we need to know and what we need to tell our patients in terms of everything from even cold chain medications that need to be refrigerated all the way to water quality. I always believe the money's in the story. So you got to listen for, and ask the right questions. I think the questions are the hardest part. And hopefully I didn't get that information in training. Hopefully people will get that now. Their childhood history matters, diet changes. Oh, medicine shouldn't be left on forever. I can't tell you how many patients have allopurinol left for 15 years and their diet has dramatically changed. Why are we still keeping some of these medications on board? So it's something to ask about. Become nutrient sufficient is my term for it, which is really get your body in better fighting shape to manage everything that we're going to be managing. Support lifestyle changes, detoxification pathways, and keep it very practical. These are my resources. These are my 2 books published through Oxford University Press from the Andrew Weil series. If you guys are interested in some really great books, go to the Integrative Medicine series through Andrew Weil. Mine was the 13th book. There's integrative cardiology, neurology. There's so many options. Then here is the consumer book within the series, a TED Talk that's 13 minutes that I actually have heard is being shared in schools, which I love because that's my next set of work I want to do is get this as much as I can into schools nationally, but it's very simple if you want to show patients or at least tell them about it. And then this is my new book, which I'm incredibly proud of. 5 years of work since the last one, but really dumbing down what's the simplest messages, the 21-day plan, how to do this through the 4 A's I named for environmental health navigation to make it very simple, allowing people to have their own journey, no judgment, no regret. It's really handholding, but it's all solutions. It's solutions-based and very positive. Tough topic, but really, I think it moves well. If you want to have people follow me, your patients or yourself, please go to thesmarthuman.com. I have courses. I have a small course on heavy metals, on EMF radiation, on pesticides. I'm putting more up. So please use that as a resource for the website, Instagram, TikTok, podcast, YouTube.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.